Thank you. So moved. And on to the first of our reports. So 7.1 on page 11 of your papers. Can I just invite Sharon Hugenrad and Sergeant Cam McBride to come up? Thank you. Welcome, thank you. You might need to turn your microphone on. So the right-hand button. Lovely, thank you. So we're going to look at your recommendation that we approve the request for a temporary liquor ban over Caroline Bay while Brew's on the Bay. Yes, so please.
Okay, so this report is to request a temporary alcohol control area to be imposed on the Caroline Bay area for the upcoming Brews on the Bay event being held on the 1st of October for a period of 7 hours. The alcohol control area would provide the New Zealand Police with the ability to deal with a disorder or congregation of members of the public consuming alcohol for the duration of the event. You'll note that the area actually extends out into the bay. This is to remove the temptation for the public to use personal watercraft whilst consuming alcohol, listening to the music, but perhaps not such an issue at the moment at this time of the year. And I ask that the report be taken as read, and both myself and Sergeant McBride are happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've got, thank you, Councillor Burt. All those in favour? Aye. So carried. Thank you. That was easy. Welcome, Debbie. So tell us, annual report, this is a regulatory thing?
That's correct. So basically, the report just addresses the requirements under the legislation, under the Sale of Alcohol and Liquor Act, and it also includes a survey which Arlo or the Ministry of Justice actually sends out to us every year, and they tweak the requirements or the questions, should I say, for each report every year. So that's all included there. That survey goes, and this report goes up to the Ministry of Justice, and they compile a report going up to the Minister with that information. So that's just a bit of background. So I'll take the report as read, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Debbie, Sharon, regarding the report? I'm happy to move that we note that report, receive and note that report. Thank you, Councillor O'Reilly. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you very much. Page 30. Come on up, Rosie. And Andrew. Good morning. Are we set? Welcome. Welcome. Now, one of you will be Alan McMahon.
That's me.
Welcome, Alan. Thank you for your really comprehensive report. And I believe you have a presentation for us?
Yes, I believe we have, but
Pardon? Oh, and your microphone, Alan, when you're speaking. Yep, your right-hand button.
Right.
Yep, that's it.
Perfect. We might need to wait a minute. Apologies to see what's happened to our presentation.
While we wait for that, everyone, we can take the report as read. Does anyone have any questions? Although they're likely to be answered during the presentation, I imagine.
can I just might introduce the report in the first instance anyway?
Great.
That's fine. So this report has been prepared in response to, I guess, to support the growth management strategy. So during that process, there was a lot of questions being asked around, what is Timaru's housing demand, and we're particularly looking at the crystal ball gazing into the future. So you have the purest planning views of you have this land and you can have this particular density and you can put this many houses in there. What we have done is to support that, and just to make sure that we are moving in the right direction, is actually getting more of a business type analysis of what is the actual market demand out there, and bringing into concepts of what is quality housing, as opposed to simply just land availability. So this is where this is. So we're just waiting on the presentation, which, just a few technical issues here. Sorry about, apologise for that.
We've got a bit of new tech going on today.
Yeah, new system.
So what you're saying is this really is adding to the body of evidence that's informing.
That's correct. It is about informing the GMS and making sure that we do have confidence in what we're moving forward with. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure where we're at with the IT.
No, well, we did provide them a while ago, so.
1 minute, sorry.
Oh, is that the sign? 1 minute.
Carry on, Alan, what were you saying?
Well, we did provide the slides some days ago, so hopefully they should be ready. But I can start anyway. So I'm Alan McMahon, as has been noted. I'm head of strategic advisory services for Colliers in New Zealand, and this is Will Silk, who's the senior analyst, who was the main data hunter and miner and analyst for this project. We both work in Auckland, but don't hold that against us. We do work of this nature around the country, and we were asked to look into to provide some insights into how the residential property markets can help to understand limitations on your growth. We were asked to look at existing residential typologies, sales and rental data, demographics, business demographics, and come to some conclusions, and taking into account detailed comparisons with the districts of Selwyn, Ashburton, Waimate and Waitaki. But without the pictures, there's not really much more I can tell you about it.
It was a very thorough report, and I really appreciated all the graphics that were in there. It made it a lot easier to understand.
Yeah, well, I know people have said earlier in earlier presentations or topics that they've taken the report as read. I'm not sure if we can be quite as confident this time, 160 pages. But
It was.
and then compared it in detail to the other four, and then came to some conclusions. We have we've boiled down our 160 pages to about 15 pages of slides. So any second now, you will be having that treat.
I wish I could even say what's going on, but I have no idea. I'm sure these are wrinkles that will get ironed out, though, as we get used to our new tech.
10 or 15 years ago, I would never have come to one of these without my A3 flip chart. And this is the first time since about 2003 that would have been useful right now.
We've actually got an A3 flip chart in the next meeting room if you'd like to quickly draw.
We also need an A3 printer. Or you can gather around our laptop, but that doesn't really work.
I think we're making progress. Councillor Booth, did you have a question?
I guess probably while we're waiting, we could have a discussion. I guess from my point of view, I feel as if we've become a retirement home here in Timaru, and we need to change that somehow, and it's as if we need to probably do what we're not supposed to do, and that's like open up a whole lot of land and be radical. And so, I mean, your experience, I mean, have you, I mean, we see other districts close by that are actually doing exactly that, and they're creating opportunities for people to build their own home, families to come, and we've looking to at this, the settings have been that we're promoting infill and trying to encourage people to stay within the city limits and go up, I guess. But you know, we're only a small population, sparsely spread. You know, what's the point? I mean, should we be looking more broadly and opening up and doing something in some of the flatter areas? And how do we change, I guess, how do we change that stereotype of being a place for a retirement home, and which is what we appear to be? We've got a lot of economic growth going on, but we don't seem to be attracting the people.
Well, that's the nub of the issue. And what we will demonstrate any minute now is that the population overall of the district is static, by and large. The number of the growth projected in the 15 to 39-year-old cohort, which is the key in terms of population growth and employment growth, is static to reducing. So the question is, how can housing, oh, here we go, good. How can housing help that? And we will discuss that, but I'll also try and give you an answer to your question now, that it's opening up of greenfields or providing any kind of new housing doesn't necessarily result in people buying it or it being successful and people moving into Timaru. Housing is quite cheap, so the price shouldn't generally be a major hindrance to that. But we know that there are employers in Timaru who cannot get people to work for them, and one of the reasons that they report back is that the housing, the options for housing are not appropriate for these people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that opening up greenfields land is the answer. It doesn't mean that anything in particular is the answer, because it's a complicated problem, but there's already quite a lot of greenfield land, as I understand it. There's also zoned land in the city centre, but there's buildings on them, and it gets a bit complicated. The median house price in Timaru is 440,000 or something like that, and it's not economic to develop new housing at that. You cannot, as you will know, you can't develop and sell at that level. It has to be 600,000 or 700,000 or 800,000 or something, depending on all the costs. If you develop in greenfields areas, the disadvantage is that they have to be serviced. The infrastructure to get to them can be expensive and difficult, and the developer at the sort of house prices that are achievable here will be reluctant to contribute a lot of that cost because their margins are already under pressure. Maybe more intensification or smaller houses towards the city centre might be an alternative option as well as that, or instead of that, where the infrastructure costs are less. The majority of houses here, which we'll talk about any second now, are older, quite big sections, quite expensive to maintain. And if that's what you're looking for, a bigger house, then there's already quite a lot of availability, though not new, which is a very different thing. So I think there is merit in what you say, but there's also complexity, and it wouldn't necessarily, they build it and they will come argument doesn't really work in our view. However, we're in business.
Right.
So,
Fingers crossed.
yeah, well, no. Where am I pointing this? Oh, I thought we were so close, so close. Yeah. Yeah, we could have done that.
There is something nice about old school, though.
There we go. every time we want to change it, we have to get somebody to rush out the room though, which is not ideal.
No, I think we've got the dongle sorted now, we're good.
Okay,
We're going to sing out to them and they'll change when we're
okay, we'll change now. Right, so I've already said this really. So this is what we were asked to look at. Existing residential typology, sales and rental data, local demographics, business demographics, as clues to the answers to the very questions that Councillor Booth was just posing. And we looked at not just Timaru, but Selwyn, Ashburton, Waimate and Waitaki. Next, please. So this is the point I was making. This is the age of houses and townhouses and units in Timaru. Some of this data we'll be presenting will be known to you because it's from the census, which is now quite old, 2018. But other data is from, we've collated, which you probably haven't seen before, from other data sources like Property Guru, which we subscribe to and use a lot. This one tells you that, well, at a glance, you can see, if you can read the time frames from the three tallest bars there are the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. And since then, each bar being 1 decade, you can see that the number of houses built in Timaru has declined substantially from then. The light-coloured blue is townhouses or units, and the darker blue are houses. So in the 1970s, there were 800 townhouses built, which is quite surprising, and that's about half of all of them that exist now. And since then, of course, the production has been much lower. Ignore the very last one, that's from 2020 to 2029, so we haven't really had much of that period yet. But you can see that in the starting 2010, 2019, 90, not that many. 43% of these standalone or detached houses that exist now were constructed between 1950 and 1979. So hence the conclusion that the stock is quite old, and the reason you would think that the simple reason that the 80s, 90s and so on have not replicated the 50s, 60s and 70s is demand and feasibility. There hasn't been much demand. If there had been more demand, then prices would have been higher and it would have been easier and more feasible to develop. But it hasn't. Next one, please. This the one that's easier to read there is residential building consents in the district, and the bars represent 1 year each from 2003. So you can see 2022 already. The very last rightmost bar is one of the highest, and we're only halfway through. So there have been a lot of residential building consents this year, but 87% of all of those in that whole period from 2003 were for standalone houses. That's the blue, and then the dark grey is for terraced houses, and the light grey is retirement units. So there was a bit of a blip, a bit of a boost in 2017. That's the tallest one of all, with a lot of retirement units. So that reflects the comment earlier that it is, a retirement town. It's not entirely true to say that, but certainly the proportion of over 65s is significantly higher than in many other areas. We're looking here just at Timaru for 1 or 2 more slides, and then we'll start the comparison with all the other districts. So next one, please.
So here we're looking at house sales for just the 12 months between March 2021 and 2022 in the urban centre of Timaru. And so what we've done is compared the sale price to the floor area, basically. There is a relationship. Obviously, the larger the home, the higher it sells for. But as some of these houses do get bigger, that the variance in these prices does change. Most sales are sort of between that 350 and 550 mark, but to make development really feasible, the prices would probably have to be higher that were being achieved for these houses. Yeah. Next slide, please. So looking at the existing typology mix of houses across different districts. So we've got here, this is district wide, and just looking at the freestanding houses. We kind of note in our report that there is about 16% of the dwellings in Timaru are either units or terrace type, but we are just focusing on houses here. We can see that 60% of houses in Timaru are 3-bedroom in size. That is comparative to Ashburton, Waimate and Oamaru. However, Selwyn district, being Rolleston and Lincoln combined, actually has a larger percent of 4-bedroom homes. More than half are 4-bedroom. And the sizes, the average floor of these homes as well is bigger in Selwyn. However, the average floor area for homes in Timaru is very similar comparatively to Ashburton, Waimate and Oamaru. Yes.
Okay, next one, please.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier that in Timaru district only, the housing stock was relatively old, and in this slide we compare it to the other 4 districts that we're looking at. The interesting comparisons, Timaru, the highlighted large sort of blue 2 columns on the, go to that one, on the left, come back. You can see, assuming you can all read this on your screens, but maybe for the benefit of the people who don't have the screens, the 2010 to, sorry, if you look at 1990 to the current day in Timaru, 15% of the houses were built since 1990, 9% in the 90s and 6% since then. Actually 1990 and the 2000s and 6% then. If you compare that to Selwyn, which we will argue is not comparable in many ways, but just looking at that is quite stark, that 95% of the houses in Selwyn were built since 1990, as opposed to 15% in Timaru. The other districts, if we add up the last 20 years, last 30 years rather, in Ashburton 27%, Waimate 14%, and Oamaru 15%. So Selwyn is the one that sticks out as having a much more modern, more recently constructed housing stock. And we'd argue that the reason for that is clearly the demand for houses has been strong, and the demand tends to push prices up, and prices going up makes development more feasible. And the reason the demand is stronger is because of the increasing population, and the reason for the increasing population is that there's a lot of jobs being created, and the reason for that is economic activity and economic drivers. So stuff happening, economic drivers, economic activity, creating job opportunities is one thing, and you've got a bit of that in Timaru also, but not to the extent, not with the force that makes development of housing at scale easily feasible and provides margins to developers that would persuade them to come and build houses. Next slide, please. Is that it? Yeah. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. Median sale price trends for houses. So looking at about the 4th row down there in the bold, we're looking at median sale prices right now, or in April 2022, which is the most recent data we have. In Timaru, 465,000. Rolleston, Selwyn, 798. The 2 parts of Selwyn. Rolleston, 798. Lincoln, 920. And the others, 400 and something, like Timaru. So the clearly highest by a margin, almost double in some cases, is Selwyn district, and it's for the reasons I just explained a minute ago. It's simply economic activity, economic drivers making development feasible on the back of strong population growth and a lot of infrastructure spending, which again is the provision of infrastructure, A, it's necessary for the development of new housing, but B, it's an attractant of itself. It's not just roads, it's schools and it's shopping and it's all the other stuff, the amenity that attracts people to an area. If you look at the 5 and the 10-year growth, that's the lower half of the table. Actually, growth in Timaru in terms of, this is median house price sale, well, house sale price, sorry. 10-year growth per annum, this is a compounded annually growth rate, reading across not that different, 7%, 6%, 7%, 6%, 9%, 9%. So that's kind of okay. Timaru stacks up well there. And on a 5-year growth per annum, again, okay, but Oamaru, Waimate have actually done quite well over 5 years. And if you look at the very last row, 12 months, you can see why, that Oamaru has caught up with Timaru, now has a very similar median sale price, which it didn't used to. It used to be quite a lot lower. And that's on the back of a somewhat astonishing 26% growth in the last 12 months, which we know has, if it hasn't stopped entirely, it's decelerating fast. So we'll go back to normal service will be resumed, presumably when we get more equilibrium back in the housing market. Next one, please. There's a lot of data in this, obviously, and you can read all this at your leisure, but this is a measure of activity, sales volume, how many houses sell and how long does it take to sell each one, average days to sell. And you can see in this again that Timaru is, in terms of days to sell, it's fine. It's pretty, all of these, in fact, if you look in the days to sell, April 22, across the 6, we've got five districts, but we've divided Selwyn into Rolleston and Lincoln. Days to sell, 32, 26, 26, 28, 29, 30. That suggests a market in equilibrium. Houses are selling quite fast. So although house prices are relatively modest and have, modest in Timaru, it doesn't mean that there's no demand. They're selling quite well. They're only taking 30 days to sell. It's probably a bit longer by now. We haven't got the data on that. But the growth in activity is zero. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that the market has been in equilibrium for some time. The increased number of sales in Ashburton, Rolleston and Lincoln, we note, is because there's been a lot more houses built there, so you would expect more activity. Next slide, please.
So this slide again is is looking at all the districts and is comparing rental bonds, being the number of active rental properties that have bonds lodged with MBIE, and the median rent for all property types. So this is very similar to the growth in median house prices when you sort of look at trends. The median price is higher in Selwyn and Ashburton, much as the median sales price is. Similarly, when you're looking at Waitaki and Timaru compared, if you go back to 2012, the median rent paid per week in April 2012 in Waitaki was actually less than it is in Timaru. However, and in April 2021, that rent was also still below. And in April 2022, you see that median rent has actually jumped above what that is in Timaru. And it suggests that people may have found more value in Waitaki in the past, and that has driven growth at an exorbitant level. Markets can get quite heated, and that does sort of create unnatural growth, I guess. And much like the median sale price, we sort of expect that will actually settle and simmer and stabilise more in line with what you see in Timaru. Yeah.
Next, thank you.
So this is comparing the obviously the census data in a really fine form. There are a lot of numbers up there. You will obviously be familiar with the Timaru district numbers itself. When we're looking at the age population, you can see that there is a high percentage of in that 65 plus category. It's sitting, just below 30%, which is similar to the population distribution in Waitaki and Waimate. Selwyn and Ashburton, again, kind of sits with the high economic drivers and that economic growth that there are higher percentages of younger people. And when you're looking at New Zealand as a whole, 18%, so around that 20% mark of 65 plus is a lower percentage of people in that age bracket. The personal income you can see is compared across there. Selwyn and Ashburton, again, more. Waimate, Waitaki, Timaru actually has the higher median personal income in 2018. Obviously that may have changed, but when you're looking at New Zealand as a whole, it's very much the same. The interesting thing is under the next little category, the not in the labour force category, being those that have chosen to remove themselves from the labour market, can be categorised as people who have retired, which again sits with that 65 plus cohort of people, and that is quite a large number. Again, similar to Waimate and Waitaki districts, but lower, but more than Selwyn and Ashburton. Home ownership, we kind of note, is pretty good. 72% is above the national average, and is pretty in line with what you're seeing in other places. Selwyn is very high at 79%, kind of indicating that a lot of that new development in Selwyn is actually being fueled by people coming into the market and building and owning themselves.
Sorry, just one question on that. Is there any data around distribution of people post earthquake with that greater Christchurch area? Have more people gone to that area, or are they just coming outside of Christchurch and building in Selwyn? Is there any data to support a view either way?
We don't have that data on us, but if you looked at the censuses or censi, to be pompous, they're all out of sync, as you know, since the earthquakes. But anecdotally, and in fact you can see with your eyes that there has been a lot of movement out of Christchurch to Selwyn. Absolutely, we don't have the data on that because the censuses are too far apart. But yes, I mean, we know that has been a major influence on Selwyn's growth. Is a immigration from the earthquake affected parts of Christchurch.
Just in relation to Selwyn, is there a combined
Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Just in regards to the Selwyn developments, is that a combined one, or is that council with private investment, or a combination of both? What is the biggest driver? Do we know those stats around that at all?
No, we don't. I mean, that data is researchable in terms of what public investment there has been, but my guess would be both substantial, not one dominating the other by a massive amount. Right. So I think what tends to happen is that the public sector in some form, local or central, recognises that there is demand for a certain area. They put the infrastructure in, but it's preceded by private demand, but it requires that infrastructure to make it happen. So it would be firstly, as the mayor said, private people saying we would like to go and live in Selwyn district, and then the developers start to think about building houses. They make applications for consent. It's apparent that we need more infrastructure and more services and water and sewerage, and then that follows. But So it's a waffly answer to repeat. The best we can do is say they've both been very substantial, but we could actually research that.
Yeah,
and
no, I
let you know
think they're really important because I know it's a question that's been asked sometimes around the table here about
Yep.
can we do a model that combines both interests and what's the benefits? Obviously, is the development and growth and the encouragement of people coming into the district as well. So,
Yeah. There's an example which isn't entirely, might not seem entirely relevant, but we're doing a bit of work for Auckland Council and government agencies on the development of Drury south of Auckland, and that was definitely predicated on the basis of several very large planned subdivisions, which then clearly didn't have the required infrastructure. And First Council in Auckland, but then they didn't quite have the capital, and then consequently central government are investing billions in transport and water and sewerage and power and so on. In that case, what seemed like an enormous amount of private investment has been dwarfed by the required public investment, and I think that would typically be the pattern, that when it's all done, you find that the public investment has actually been a lot more. But we'll get back to you on
I
that.
think that'd be really beneficial if we could even comparisons between Ashburton and Selwyn.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Next
So,
one, please.
no, this is the right one.
Oh, beg your pardon.
So this is the population projections. Again, I've read them in some of the other reports that have been provided to you by other people. The growth is a mid-level projection that's shown up here. It is pretty static. That there is that high growth in Selwyn. You've got that high growth in the 65 plus age bracket in Selwyn. However, that is the trend nationally. New Zealand is an ageing population. That is one of the issues that is going to be contested. That all areas of the country are going to have to work with. But what you've got there is probably the strongest growth out of the 5 districts in that sort of 15 to 39 and 40 to 64 age bracket. Both being a lot of the age brackets that actually demand newer modern houses, have specific requirements. They're the ones that will be moving around districts with their families and setting up shop. So, Selwyn does seem to have that sort of driver, which again, we've seen through a lot of these slides. But the comparison between Timaru, Waimate, Waitaki and Ashburton even is that those populations are pretty static. And so inherently, a lot of the problems will be similarly faced between all of them when it comes to housing. Okay. Yep. Next. Yeah. And again, I mean, what we had a look into this at quite a high level, the number of businesses or business entities and employees. To just give some context, there's good levels of economic growth in Timaru by comparison, and especially compared to Waimate and Oamaru. Obviously, Selwyn and Ashburton has grown significantly faster, but we do attribute that to the distance between Selwyn and Christchurch and Ashburton to Selwyn in some sense.
Next, please. So getting to the nub of it, no more pictures, just some words. These are abbreviations of the points made in the report, and I'm not just going to read them out, but I will pick a few. I think we've mentioned a few times the Selwyn district's growth is due to its proximity to Christchurch and augmented significantly by the exodus following the earthquakes. But what Selwyn does have, which may be more relevant to Timaru, which otherwise obviously hasn't had those circumstances, is they have a wider mix of typologies. They're not dominated by one typology, which Timaru is. They've got more larger homes. Ashburton is not quite as close, obviously, to Christchurch, but it has newer housing stock, and the population is younger, and those two factors are not unconnected. Looking at Waimate, its population growth projections are almost nil, and it's got pretty old population and has seen actually a lower level of economic activity and growth than Timaru, and has got lowest housing costs. And again, these factors are all connected. Next one, please. And a bit more of a comparison here, just to Waitaki District, rather than the summaries to the others on the previous slide, because Waimaru is quite similar, quite a comparable town in terms of age cohorts, prices, rents, and that sort of stuff. And it's not close to a major centre. It's about the same drive time from Dunedin as we are from Christchurch. It has prices have grown in the last few years, but only to the point that it's matching Timaru. It's very similar, really. Houses make up 84% of all the residential property types in Oamaru, and it's at 80% here. Very few terraced houses. The only reason we think that Oamaru's done relatively well in the last couple of years in terms of house prices is just a catching up. It was a bit slow probably, but we think it'll probably progress similar to Timaru in over time in the future. Next one, please. So this last slide summarizes 4 or 5 pages of our unreadable report, unmissable report. That was a Freudian slip. I'm sure you've all read. So the basics are that it's hard to build new houses, increase the typology mix or the options for incoming people when the population growth is about nil, and what growth there is in the non-working population largely. You've already got high existing home ownership. It makes residential feasibility challenging. It's not like there's thousands of people renting who would love to be able to buy. There's not that many renters. Demand pressure. You saw, if you remember that scatter diagram early in the piece, which Will described, there was a concentration of house sales, all those blue dots in a mass between 350 and 500,000. That's where almost all the sales are. There were a few dots further up, 6, 7, 8, 900,000, and there's a few of those sales, but there's one here, one there, one there. Sales like that are not going to, or the availability of houses of those small numbers is not going to change the future population growth or the demand for housing in Timaru. You need a lot more. These sort of things we would summarise that there's a definite correlation between rising population, rising house prices, and rising economic activity, but they go in reverse order in a way. You need economic activity, which we have, which creates a demand for housing, which creates the feasibility of developing housing. And there's a little bit of that going on, but to really get the population increasing and to get more housing typology choices, you need more of that economic activity. If you were to invest in infrastructure, which I know is a topic of some debate, roads, schools, hospitals, civic centres, shopping, and improvements to the city centre of a more modest nature, that's all really important. If people considering coming to live here will look at not just how much does a house cost and can I afford it and where is it, it's what's the whole town like. So is it got a nice town centre? Is there stuff to do? What's the education like? What for my kids? How is it easy to travel in and out? All of that stuff. What's healthcare like? What's childcare like? None of this is easily soluble. It's big, long-term stuff. In terms of interventions, which you could do because all the things I described are going to take a long time, potential employment growth employment growth will certainly be aided by the availability of affordable housing, not so much, or not for start again. There's a raft of new people would like to work in Timaru. There's jobs which are not very well paid, there's jobs which are very well paid. The very well paid, they might get a house, an $800,000 house in a greenfield subdivision, that's fine, but for the process workers or other less well paid workers, that's not going to work. So they will need either affordable houses to buy, and a 400,000 60-year-old house with a big section costs a lot to maintain, the section. It's all a bit daunting. Isn't necessarily attractive. What would be attractive is a small, say, a terraced house, or a 2 or 3 bedroom terraced house, or a townhouse in the near or in the city centre, either to buy or to rent. There's quite a movement now developing build to rent, like long-term rental buildings owned by one owner, not the traditional mum and dad investor. And we've done a lot of work in this area. And that's a perfectly valid long-term housing solution, a 5-year or a 10-year lease. In fact, the government's just defined build to rent as 20 houses, 20 dwellings or more in a single development where the tenants get offered 10-year leases. So that's perfectly valid housing option. So you could think about that. You could think about encouraging more smaller house types, and they typically would be in the inner suburbs, because if you want a big house, you're probably happy to go to a new greenfield subdivision. There are, in terms of kick-starting the process, because otherwise it's quite a long process, you can intervene. You can offer land free, you can defer settlements, you can do all sorts of stuff, but that's risky and potentially expensive. Otherwise, it's just increasing the availability of more modestly priced but really high quality new, smaller houses is probably the single most important thing we think could be done. And that's the end of our slides.
Thank you very much, Alan, and really great in-depth stuff, and it's really good for us to have that expert opinion to inform our decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything else to add, Rosie? Andrew?
Any other questions?
Questions? Councillor Booth?
Yeah, I've got a couple. Actually, we'll go right back to the start, the graph where our buildings fell off the scale right at the very start, where we were building between 78 and 80. 70 and 80, we built a lot of houses.
Yeah.
And then the next 10 years, we built hardly any. Was that a common theme throughout the country? Was that caused through the GFC, or
well,
how did...
The peak was the 70s, so the 80s. So there was a bit of the share market crash, which us in the older age cohorts can remember, 87, 88, 89. The 80s actually was more than the 90s, which was more than the 2000s, and GFC wasn't till 2008, was it? Seemed a long time ago now. 8, 9, 10, 11, when we were in recession. And from 2019, we actually built a few more. So I know you can't really see this, but this was the chart. This was the one we were looking at, and that is there's a similar pattern in many other centres, but not as pronounced as it is.
Would that be more a rural or
Yes.
a rural type
That's
of situation rather than
yeah.
a city like Auckland or a Christchurch?
Look, I think I've been around for a while, but I wasn't involved in building houses in the 1950s, the 1960s, or even the 70s. But my sense is that it was a lot easier.
Okay.
It was much cheaper relative. It was obviously much cheaper, but even relatively compared to the cost of living and wages and so on, it was a lot cheaper then. Government was encouraging. Mortgages were very, very, very cheap. And known to be cheap for a long time, not just like last year they were 2%, now they're 6%. That's a different thing. So yeah, it was easier, and that is the general national trend. But as I say, it's much more pronounced here than it would be on a national scale.
Could that have been caused by government change of government,
Yeah,
perhaps they're
absolutely.
building a lot of state houses perhaps in that period of time, or
State
obviously you
houses,
mentioned
and there were,
government assistance.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay, then I want to go back to your graph around, which was around about number of business entities and employees, and we are well ahead of actually
Yes.
all the other districts. And so that sort of either indicates to me that we've got a lot of double income families, perhaps, or those other districts that people are travelling out to work out of the district. But nevertheless, it's quite substantial. And I guess, how do we create that stepping stone for people? So we've got a lot of people who bought a house, a $440,000 house in Timaru. They've got a young family, 2 incomes, and they want to actually build a new home and in a new community, and therefore it's like moving up the ladder. It might be a $700,000 or $800,000. They can afford that, and then that then creates the opportunity for the people to rent, to move into those either rentals or a lower cost entry for those other people coming, mostly blue collar workers that are coming here. There is a medium, perhaps that is lifting a little, but nevertheless, those blue collar workers are earning more and more money all the time. So is there a gap somewhere, is what I'm trying to get at, that is causing us to be in this rut of being a retirement settlement? We seem to be in a spiral.
Sorry. I think there is a gap, but if the family you describe can sell their house for $440,000 and buy one for $750,000, that's fine. You know, the market will sort of take care of that, because you can economically, feasibly build on a piece of land and sell for $750,000, and the developer's happy with that because they've made a good margin. So the market kind of takes care of that. That might be a simplistic answer, but in sort of generically speaking. But I think the gap that is what I described earlier, which is the high quality, new, low maintenance, especially if you've got like 2 incomes and kids and you haven't got much time. House either to buy or to rent. It still needs to be good quality so that it's low maintenance and it's comfortable and it's dry and it's warm. Therefore, to be affordable, it has to be small. So it has to be 2 or 3 bedrooms, not 3 or 4 or 5. And I think that's the gap. And if you're building more intensively, sort of medium density rather than the low density we've all been used to, then the logical place for that is not greenfields. It's not sites in the periphery of the town. It's more infill sites, or it's new sites within a few kilometres of here. Because that's where you get the best amenity and the best access to services. And that's another convenient aspect that these lower to medium earning families would want. And as I mentioned before, my view is not necessarily the view of the house buying public, but my view is that if that solution is a rental solution, which is a much easier thing to achieve because you don't need $150,000 cash, it's perfectly valid.
Thanks, Councillor Booth. Any further questions for Alan or Will or Rosie or Andrew? I'm happy to move that we receive and note that report. Thank you, Councillor Burt. All those in favour? Thank you very much. Most informative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to report 7.4, page 208 in your agenda. And I'll just ask Paul to kick us off with this one. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say a couple of words just to frame this report at a high level, that when I came back to Timaru District Council sort of 15 months ago, it was apparent that we had a gap in knowledge in terms of what what was happening at a granular level in our in our market in terms of land use. So it became very apparent that we had to do this body of work to get to this report today. And I think it's fair to say from that previous presentation that we now have that level of knowledge that informs this report to justify this sort of balanced position that we've arrived at. So with that in mind, and all that effort and work that's gone on in the last 12 months by the planning team and our consultants on our behalf, I'll hand over to Hamish to speak to the report.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome, Hamish and Megan. Take it away.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou. So this really is the topic that for many people lies at the heart of what a district plan is all about. And as we've been hearing today and in subsequent workshops, there's been a lot of work which has gone into the preparation of this report, a lot of thinking and a lot of discussion. And really this paper draws together a lot of those threads. The focus of a lot of this discussion and work has been on the greenfield land, and yeah, there's a lot of debate that has gone on at an international, national and local level around the supply of land, which is inelastic. It's many ways it's very different from other markets. What we've got here really is a little bit of a vision that looks ahead 25 years, acknowledging though that there are trade-offs of upzoning rural land, and that's increasingly recognised through both national and regional policy. So as Paul said, it's been a bit of a balancing act, and I guess it's going to require, if council takes this forward with the district plan, a lot careful management through subsequent confirmation of details in terms of how it's going to look on the ground. We've already touched, I think, with Colliers this morning on some of those issues around demand and funding and infrastructure. But for what it's worth, what we've produced, I believe, allows room for significant flex and expansion should that need arise. We've done a little bit of testing over the last couple of weeks, and in terms of talking to people out and about in the town. We've done Timaru, Temuka, Geraldine, and the results were fairly pleasing. It was a fairly small sample size of people, but some quite well-informed questions. We're looking at more zoning of land in Geraldine and Timaru for residential zoning, and that seemed to find the right mix. In a couple of other small towns, there's some rural residential additional zoning as well that's gone into that. So we've been on a bit of a journey, as Paul said. It's something that the team have acknowledged since the start of the process. It's been at the very heart of what a district plan is all about. And going forwards, though, if we do accept these recommendations, then there still needs to be more discussion, potentially around some of those ideas that have been mentioned earlier around how do we stimulate more housing building and maybe incentivising developers getting infrastructure in place and keeping the viability of the centre town going. So that's probably all I need to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamish. Great report, easy to read. Any questions for Hamish or Paul or Megan? Councillor Piddington.
Thanks. Hamish, just regards point 24, the exception is O'Neill's Place in Redruth. I've got an article from the Herald off the front page on the 25th of May where that developer said he got a resource consent to build land or to build houses. So which is it?
He got a rural consent, well, yeah, essentially a subdivision consent to break some of those land into some smaller parcels, but it's not really, there's a world of difference between that and intensive housing development subdivision. I did also take note of that article, and I don't think it quite captures the spirit of that resource consent that he did get consent.
So he can't do the 150 houses he's claiming here. It's just that people in the community have asked me about that.
I think I'd need to go into that in more detail with you afterwards. Essentially, though, no, he hasn't quite got what is set out. If that's what you've taken away from that article, then no, there's a lot more work involved in that.
There's a subdivision plan in that article.
Thank you, councillor Puddington. Any other questions for Hamish? Mayor Bowen.
Sorry, my question was, I know we had Cameron Baggery, the economist, come and talk to us. Did he provide any written reports through this process, or no?
Through you, Madam Chair. No, Mayor Bowen, he just provided the presentation that he gave on the day. We've spoken to him, and he's spoken along similar themes to what our colleagues, our friends at Colliers have mentioned, that to change in a significant way requires a significant intervention, and he was of that view.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just the one point that he raised, which I thought was of interest in looking to the past report around our age of building stock, is that factoring that percentage replacement in, and it still has to be delivered by developers. But it is an interesting, point. And if you look at the average age of a house, say 80 years, that's another 1.25% of demand that should be factored into growth projections.
Thanks, Mayor Bowen. Councillor Burt.
I think this morning has only left us in that same position where there is so many unanswered questions. All due respect to the Colliers report, the issue between apples and oranges and Ashburton and Selwyn and us, totally and utterly different in terms of the triggers and where people are moving, the things, the incentives, why people are actually doing those moves to invest and what have you. We're completely different. We have an economic arm that tells us what we're doing and why we're doing it. We have significant growth here economically, and yet we do have a high age discrepancy in our demographic. We have the ability to bring people tomorrow for low-end jobs. But we need that housing gap, and we need rentals. Rentals, if you're an investor in rental at the moment, you'll know that so many incentives have been taken off you, ripped away. It's not even worth it unless you decide to unlock the benefits of a 10-year build to rent, which this morning it opened my eyes that potentially that could be something, if we were a council, to look at that. That's something we probably could do while that's available to us. Other than that, there's a lot more work to be done, a lot to understand, and I think I'd like to move that we take recommendation B, proceed in line with the updated recommendations of the plan study for additional controlled greenfield zone land. I'd like to move that.
Thank you. Do we have someone to second? Thank you, Councillor Oliver. All those in favour, just say aye. 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 Anyone against? So moved. Thank you very much. I think that concludes the Environmental Services agenda for today. Thank you very much, all those in attendance.